Hi, everyone. I am Lily Gil Valletta, CEO and co-founder of the cultural intelligence company CM Plus and the market research tech Culture Intel. And I am so excited to be joining you today as part of the Hispanic Leadership Summit to actually talk about a topic that many of you may be wondering about. It is the use of labels or the right label to identify our very rich community. We have heard Hispanic, we have heard Latino and Latina, but what about Latinx?
Have you heard of the term Latinx?
Latinx? No, that's my first time hearing about that.
Latinx. I don't know. Is it like Malcolm X?
Yeah, tal que el diablo. Yo, you know what I think? They think that we Latinx. Yeah, I think we are. I think that's what it is. You sure? How you know? This is what they're calling us. I'm pretty sure they keep looking at us when they say it.
But who is us? Who are they?
Who are we?
Dean Asti and Sasha Merci are Latinx stars. Stars. Write that down. Put a star next to it. How do we capture the Latinx essence?
But which one is the right term to use? Or is there such a thing as the right term? You know, the beauty of the diversity within our own community kind of sits at the center of this big question. And we are going to let the numbers do the talking. And that's why I'm coming to you today with some of the baseline understanding that we have from different academics and also stuff that Pew Research has published. But what I'm excited to share with you is brand new data that is based on the analysis of over 760,000 digital discussions that we mined and analyzed using our tech Culture Intel. The way that works is it takes all the open digital discussions that are happening everywhere, not just in social media, so that we can look at the patterns in the way people speak organically when they talk to each other without having to ask them a question. And yes, I will share those findings with you. You will receive a one-pager that summarizes some of these findings of the use of labels and terms so that we can finally decide whether to Latinx or not. Well, let's just go into the definition of the terms as we know them today. So starting with the term Hispanic, it actually roots back to an affiliation or an affinity to being Hispanos or tied to the Spanish colonization. Those of us from countries that have Spanish as the primary language spoken. Now, the need for a label of such kind here in the United States became really important in the 70s because as part of the US Census, it was recognized that we needed to be able to identify those of Hispanic descent in the United States. And then the term started being used, but it typically, as I said, encompasses those countries that speak Spanish and have a connection to the Spanish or monarquía hispana. Later on, the term Latino came to be. Latino or Latina, following the gendered nature of our language, allows you to identify as such. And it's a broader term that actually is inclusive of all countries in Latin America, not just those that speak Spanish, because it actually includes countries like Brazil as Latinos under that label and designation. But of course, because of its gendered nature, which typically defaults to calling the group Latino or Latinos, it raised the next layer of questioning about gender. Is Latino excluding women? Is Latino not being inclusive of today's quest for inclusivity in nouns and terms so that we actually have a non-binary descriptor of the community? And then Latinx came to be. It is quite unclear where it exactly started or who was the first to use it. I mean, there's different hypotheses out there. Was it as part of an LGBTQ movement that was Xing the O on the Latin O label, and then it started picking up? But clearly, you're probably hearing it or debating it in your corporate hallways, in your meetings, etc. Well, Latinx sounds very progressive and it's very fluid as it relates to the gender, but our language happens to be gendered. So is there such a thing as a perfect term or not? Each of them have their nuances, as I just described. And this is where the data can do the talking for us. You have probably read it already. Pew Research was the first to put out some information and data that possibly shocked you or surprised you the first time it was published. And it's the fact that barely 3% of the over 60 million Hispanics that live in our country use the term Latinx. And in fact, 23% of Hispanics in the US don't even know what the term is or have ever heard it. So here we are defaulting to a new label that is very likely that the everyday people, communities, families, and those that we want to reach, embrace, empower, are not even using. So are we talking to ourselves as corporate leaders? Don't let opinion sway you. Let's see what the data reveals. And I told you, we did this very powerful study using Culture Intel that scraped open digital discussions available everywhere, not just in social media, everywhere where people have been engaging for the last 12 months as it relates to the labels to use or not, what their sentiment is, and how they feel towards it. Well, here's some of those findings, which you may find quite insightful and maybe even surprising for some. Well, let's begin with the comparison of Hispanic versus Latino versus Latinx. Of those three terms, the one that secures the highest positive sentiment amongst all discussions that we analyzed was the term Latino or Latina. 81% of the discussions related to that term were positive, while for Latinx, 79% were negative. So clearly, it seems that Latino and Latina is that broader term that people gravitate to. In fact, some of the verbatims or quotes that were part of these hundreds of thousands of digital discussions analyzed say, I consider myself a pretty inclusive person, and Latino and Latina is just proper Spanish, period. So as you can see, it honors the gender nature of our language to begin with. Now, could it be that by generations, this sentiment profile changes? Well, somewhat, but here's what the data reveals. No surprise here, boomers, the older Hispanic or Latino generations of our community, are very, very negative towards the terms Latinx. In fact, 93% are negative. That little 7% that is left over is neutral. I guess they don't know enough. And there is a zero positive sentiment towards the term altogether amongst the older generations. But then when we look at millennials and Gen Xers, surprisingly, the negative sentiment towards Latinx is very loud and present. 83% of millennials are negative towards the term Latinx, and 71% of Gen Zs are negative towards the term Latinx. So there you have it. This is what the data reveals. And I know there's not a perfect term, but ultimately, as America's biggest diverse segment of the population, driving more than 50% of the growth and quickly becoming the majority in very prominent markets and places, like in the state of Texas, when we're hitting that pivotal point where the majority of the population is Hispanic. We gotta do our homework and not let the fad or the fancy terms get you all confused about the role and priority that we play in society. In fact, I'm gonna dare you with this. If you are spending more time debating what label to use as it relates to our community, and instead you're not spending the same amount of time to debate how much money, resources, budget, and priority you ought to put towards our community, you may be putting your energy in the wrong place. Because no term is perfect. We can follow what the data guides us to follow. Clearly, Latino, Latina seems to be a preferred term. Hispanic follows, and Latinx continues to be in that single digit of adoption and embracing. by the communities that we serve. Inclusivity matters, yes, terms matter. However, don't let that distract you from what matters most, which in this case is continuing to prioritize and recognize the value and the power that we bring as one big unit, as one society and community that wants to contribute to this great nation so we can continue to stay competitive, grow, drive innovation, business creation, entrepreneurship, and everything that we have to offer as Hispanics, Latino, Latinas, or Latinx, whatever is the right term for you. But now you know what the data says, and hopefully you've learned something new today. And thank you so much. We are all human, and the Hispanic Leadership Summit for opening this great space so we can continue to learn and connect as a community. Thank you.